Okay, hello. So this is the first substantive lecture in PLPT 3020, Modern Political Theory. I'm going to plunge straight in because I've got a lot to say and not very much time to say it. It's perhaps worth noting I'm probably going to be talking quite a bit more quickly than I would if I were delivering these lectures in person. Hope that won't be too much of a problem because you can always, of course, pause the video, rewind, listen again to what I've just said. But if there are problems about that, let me know and I'll try to go slower going forward. What I want to ask today is what is it about the political theorists we're going to be reading in this semester that makes them modern? And in one sense, of course, the answer to this question is pretty straightforward. As I've already told you, this is the second in a sequence of courses that are chronologically connected. So you might say, well, they're modern political theorists just in the sense that they're political theorists who write during what we understand as the modern period, which, as you all know, at least in the European context, means the period, roughly speaking, from the mid to late 16th century through to the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. And that would be fine. It wouldn't be wrong. But of course, as you all know, historical periodization isn't just a matter of drawing arbitrary lines around, slabs of years and centuries. We also often want to define historical epochs in terms of their particular cultural character, their mood, their philosophical outlook, the sensibility, the typical sensibilities of people who operate during that period. And modernity, I want to say, is a case in point. It's not, I think, helpfully understood just as a span of time measured in years and centuries. It's also a particular episode in the story of our species, marked by certain characteristic concerns, by certain changes and transformations in the way human communities organize themselves and think about themselves. To bring this general point out, I want to suggest to you that it's helpful to think about modernity in this broader, richer sense as a category analogous to a category like puberty or adolescence or middle age as applied to phases in a person's autobiography, right? Now, of course, all of these things, too, could be defined in terms of time. You could say, look, puberty, roughly speaking, typically begins around 10 or 11, runs through your teenage years, and most of us are kind of through it, hopefully, by the time we're 19 or 20. Middle age, you might say, roughly speaking, that period in a person's life from their mid-30s through to their early 50s. You could, of course, define these phases in a person's biography just in those temporal terms. But, of course, you'd miss a lot about what it means to be going through puberty or what it means to be going through middle age. If you want a more informative, enlightening description of all of this, you talk about, for example, in puberty, you say, look, there are certain physiological changes that your body goes through. New concerns are going to come to the forefront of your attention. You're going to be a lot more concerned about sex, for example, than you were before. You'll start having crushes on people. You'll be arguing with your parents all the time. You'll likely be suffering mood swings or be prone to rebelliousness in various ways. Middle age, right? You're probably putting on a little bit of weight. You might be about to go through a midlife crisis of some typical sort, right? Perhaps your marriage is likely to fail, or perhaps you're getting depressed about the project and wondering what the point of it all is. Right? When we define these phases in a human life in that way, we're not just concerned with timing, we're concerned with the characteristic mood, the characteristic outlook of people who find themselves going through this particular part of their lives. Another way, perhaps, to think about this is to note what I'm sure many of you know, and if you haven't yet taken courses in which my colleagues and your classmates have talked this way, many people these days like to say that we live in a postmodern age. I'm not a big fan of that way of talking, and some of my reasons for thinking this will come out both in today's lecture and over the course of the semester. And I think people mean many, many different things when they talk about postmodernity and postmodernism and so forth. But whether you like or loathe that way of talking, or whether we're clear about exactly what it is that people mean when they refer to themselves as postmodernists, we can at least agree that when people make a big fuss about postmodernism, they're not just saying, well, we're now in an age that is chronologically later. They're also saying that there's something different about our age, something substantively different as compared with the mood and outlook and sensibility that prevailed in earlier periods. Many postmodernists, as you know, are in fact actively hostile to modernity. They think of themselves as rejecting modernity. They think that modern patterns of thought, modern forms of human organization are in important ways problematic. They're shot through with illusions and mistakes that we need to kind of outgrow. And obviously, if somebody's talking that way, they're not thinking about modernity just in terms of years. They're thinking about modernity as a substantive outlook that they want to repudiate and move past. Again, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about postmodernism in this course. It's not our topic. What I want to draw to your attention is that that way of talking presupposes that modernity isn't just a span of time. It's a distinctive set of attitudes and a characteristic sensibility. And what I want to try to do today is to specify that modern sensibility for the purposes of this course. There are a number of general themes that crop up over and over again in the people we're going to read, and all of these seem to me to be absolutely typical of a modern outlook. And I want to try to, in general, identify what that outlook looks like, and then towards the end say a little bit about the specifically political aspect of distinctively modern concerns. So that's the agenda for today. Obviously, two caveats. You know this, I probably don't need to say it, but it's perhaps worth mentioning just for the sake of it. Obviously, when we're talking about modernity, we're not talking about something that is definite in the way that, for example, a presidential term or a semester is definite, right? I mean, with a presidential term, there's an inauguration day, the president takes the oath of office, and at that point, his or her term begins, right? There's a first day of classes in a semester, and at that point, we know we're in the spring term or the fall semester or whatever it might happen to be. There's a very clear delimitation, a clear demarcation of when something begins and ends. A category like modernity, again, like puberty, not like that. There's no particular moment. We don't suddenly realize. It's not like everybody woke up one Tuesday morning in 1620 and said, "Oh, hey, we're in modernity." Right? That's not obviously how it is. These shifts in human thinking and attitudes and forms of sensibility, they occur gradually, they evolve over time, and there are, of course, always vestiges of earlier epochs that persist throughout subsequent periods. Many of you, I'm sure, are practicing Christians. You will be going to church on Sunday mornings, and of course, what happens in many churches on Sunday mornings is a throwback to various forms of ritual that were medieval in origin. And that doesn't mean we're not really living in a modern age. It just means that these shifts in sensibility are gradual and not abrupt. The other obvious caveat to enter at this point is that, of course, modernity is not a club, it's not a church, it's not something that has a kind of completely rigid definition, and so there's lots of disagreement among people who, all of whom we could classify as in some sense modern. It's not that everybody is kind of signed up to exactly the same set of doctrines or rules. It's a lot more subtle and ill-defined than that. Still, I think there are, as Wittgenstein would have put it, there are certain family resemblances, certain elective affinities, certain general themes that are absolutely typical of modern forms of thought and culture, and these are themes that are going to crop up again and again in what we're going to be reading, and I want to just highlight some of these. I asked you to read two texts for today. Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment, famous essay from the late 18th century, and Francis Bacon's, a short extract from Francis Bacon, written in about 1620, much earlier, describing what he calls the four idols. I'll be referring to Bacon and Kant in a moment, but my reason for assigning those texts is that they capture very nicely, I think, some of these themes that are characteristic of modernity. You've probably heard of Kant. Francis Bacon is a little bit less familiar, I suspect, to many of you. But it's important to remember he was an important figure in the 17th and 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, praised be his name, was, when he talked about his great heroes, he mentioned three people. He mentioned John Locke, he mentioned Isaac Newton, and he mentioned Francis Bacon. You'll have heard of Newton and Locke, but Bacon may be new to you. So he was quite a big deal in his time. So what are some of these themes? Perhaps the most basic, and I would say also somewhat elusive, is that in modernity there is a self-conscious awareness of living in something new. There is a self-consciousness about the novelty, innovativeness, unfamiliarity of the territory into which we're moving, right? I mean, even today, when we use the language of the modern, right, we refer to something that seems new. If we see a new building going up on campus and it starts to take architectural shape and somebody says, look, it looks very modern, right? What we'd immediately get from that is this sense of novelty, of newness, up-to-date, avant-garde, right? Something that is at the leading edge of some new movement or some new shift. Incidentally, this is signaled in the title of the work from which the Bacon extract is taken. That short extract is taken from a larger work by Bacon, written, of course, in Latin, so it had a Latin title, of course, in the early part of this period. The language of intellectual life was still Latin, so it's really only much later that people start writing philosophy and art criticism and science in the vernacular. Bacon's writing is originally in Latin, and the title of his work from which your extract is taken was Novum Organum, right? Which translates roughly as the new organon, right? And you, of course, know what new means. Organon is probably an unfamiliar term for you. It's perhaps worth just mentioning where it comes from. So the organon is the word that was used to describe the corpus of Aristotelian texts, works by Aristotle, dealing with logic, right? There were, I think, 6 Aristotle texts that deal with logic and reasoning and so forth. They have various titles, but they were gathered together as a corpus, and they were referred to as Aristotle's organon, right? So when Bacon refers to his book as the new organon, what he's saying is, I'm setting out a new logic, and I'm self-consciously distinguishing it from the way the ancients talked about logic and thought about reasoning. And there you've got an absolutely characteristic example of this self-consciousness of novelty, of newness. And Bacon's text in that way illustrates precisely what I'm talking about. One of the ways in which this awareness of newness comes out in modern political thought is, and social thinking more generally, is this characteristic fixation in modernity with progress, with this sense that one is moving forward in historical time, right? That there is a directionality to human history, and the species as a whole is progressing in a certain direction, along a certain trajectory. Mostly, modern thinkers, when they engage this idea of progress, they understand progress in an optimistic way, right? They see this progression as moving towards improvement, as perhaps a story with a happy ending in the end, right? And that is, I think, generally quite characteristic, but it is worth noting that that's not true of all modern thinkers, and at least some of the folks we're going to be looking at, this is true particularly of Rousseau in the Second Discourse and Marx, are a little bit more pessimistic about the directionality of modern life. Right? They certainly at some level agree that we're making progress in a direction, but they want to precisely draw attention to some of the ways in which there are downsides to the progress that we're making. And they want to criticize contemporary or modern society by highlighting some of the ways in which the direction in which we're moving is problematic. This, by the way, is one of the ways in which I'm a bit skeptical about postmodernism, because postmodernism is often defined in a similar way, that they sort of agree that we're moving from somewhere to somewhere else, but they also want to express reservations about the direction in which they're moving. And in that sense, I think that a lot of what you find in so-called postmodernism today is actually already implicit in a great deal of modern thinking. And I'll be drawing attention to that in the course of the following weeks. Concomitant with this obsession with progress is an emphasis on reform, right? And especially institutional reform. In a way, the real precursor to this in the modern period is something that happens in the religious sphere in the 16th century. As you all know, in the 16th century, you have a period of religious conflict that is sparked by the Protestant Reformation in the early part of the 16th century. And of course, the idea of a reformation includes already the idea of reform. And as you also, I'm sure, know, what the Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, people like that, what they were concerned about was what they perceived to be the corruption of the church. They see the church as becoming a threat to real piety, right? They see the Catholic Church as having surrendered to various forms of idolatry, right? The worship of relics and the pointless emphasis on ritual as opposed to the substance of Christian piety. They're also, this was a big concern for Luther, as you know, they're also concerned that the church has lapsed into the commodification of salvation. One of the big things that Luther was worried about was this practice of the sale of indulgences, right? The idea that the Catholic Church would take money from people, especially the wealthy, for the commission of sins, for I should say the remission of sins, right? That you'd pay a certain amount of money to the priest, and the priest would, as it were, put a good word for you with God, and your money would be converted into a higher probability of salvation. And Luther and Calvin and co. were appalled by this practice. They thought that it presupposed the idea of God as a kind of mafioso who you have to buy off. And they thought that this was a terrible corruption of true Christian piety, and they wanted to reform the church, purify it, and get it back on track, on the path of true faith and true belief. And that emphasis on institutional reform and purification, I think, is something that spreads from beyond the purely religious sphere and marks the entire period of modernity as a characteristic feature. And it applies and starts coming to the fore in secular contexts as well. So very many of the thinkers we're going to be reading think of themselves as social and political reformers in that sense. It's also important to remember this is a period of revolution, right? The period in Europe and also, of course, America between the 16th and the 19th century is a period of radical transformation and revolution. Some of those revolutions are, of course, political revolutions, the two great revolutions in England in the 17th century, the Civil War and the 1688 Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution in the 18th century, about which we'll be talking when we do Locke, and of course the granddaddy of them all, the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. These are movements that turn the world upside down and challenge accepted orthodoxies and make a real difference to the trajectory of politics and social life during this entire period. So you've got to think of this span of 200, 300 years as a period of incredible tumult and turmoil and transformation. And if you visited England in the early 17th century and returned to the same venues in the 19th century, you'd see a world completely transformed. Let me just give you a couple of illustrations of this. As some of you know, I grew up in Manchester in the north of England, cradle of the Industrial Revolution. What you're seeing on the slide there is a map of Manchester and Salford, two towns at the center of this conurbation, that was drawn up in 1650. And you can see there that it's a relatively small village, really, nothing more than what we would think of as a hamlet, about the size of Crozet up the road to the west of Charlottesville. After the 17th century, of course, you have the agricultural revolution, the feudal system of strip farming, in which peasants were sort of proprietors of their little strips, and they got to keep at least some of their produce for themselves and live in a somewhat autonomous way, as long as they gave a certain number of cabbages or lettuces or leeks to their lord. And the deal was that the lord would give them protection in return for this weekly contribution of foodstuffs and agricultural products and so forth. This is a period in which that feudal system of strip farming is completely transformed by what was called the enclosure movement, and you have commercial farming on a larger scale. So the strips disappear, and you get these larger farms that are the precursors of modern agribusiness. But in 1650, although there's no strips, at least I can't see any on this map, you're still talking about a predominantly rural Manchester, small village. Here is a map of Manchester and Salford about 100 years later, in 1750. You can see that it's a little bit larger, but still not very big. Here is a picture of Manchester and Salford made in 1750, 100 years after the first map I showed you. And you can see it's definitely gotten a little bit larger, but it's still basically a county town. I mean, what you're looking at could be the downtown mall area of Charlottesville. There's a couple of church towers, some townhouses developing, but there's nothing here that suggests modern heavy industry. And the whole picture is still set in a kind of agricultural framework. Got people fox hunting there in the foreground, a few horses and donkeys around, and fields and hedgerows and all the rest of it. Here is an image of Manchester just 100 years later, right? Towering chimneys spewing out smoke from the cotton mills, and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. And the whole world is completely different, right? So you've got to think of this as a period of really radical transformation. It's a bit like what's happening in China, what's been happening in China over the past few decades, right? I mean, I've spent all of my life living in declining societies, the UK and the US, and I'm desperate to go to China just because I want to see a society that's experiencing this radical takeoff that happened in the Industrial Revolution for the first time in Europe and in England specifically. So this is a time of radical transformation and newness. A second big theme of modern political thought is increasing independence from religious forms of thought and religious institutions. Throughout the medieval and early modern period, the church and Christian doctrine dominated educational life. It dominated the way people thought about social and political institutions. Increasingly in the modern period, you see a turning away from strictly Christian or revealed sources of insight. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, because, of course, it's not true that the church just disappears, right? It continues to exist, and Christian doctrine, Christian ritual, Christian patterns of thought still tremendously important during this period. I mean, today people often draw a sharp contrast between religion and science and see the 17th century as a period in which the scientific revolution was kind of decisively repudiating Christianity. That's a bit of an exaggeration because, of course, there are actually lots of links between the scientific revolution and the Christian tradition. A lot of the early scientists in that period were, in fact, Christians, and were motivated because they wanted to use science to, as they might have put it, reveal the mind of God, right? So you have to be a little bit careful about this. But it is nonetheless true that one of the distinctive characteristics of modernity is this determination to be secular, to think about our lives and our place in our social world independently of any distinctively religious insight or any particular revealed religious outlook. A third point to emphasize, and this is in a way related to the point about secularity and religion, is that throughout the modern period there's an emphasis on emancipation, liberating people from oppression, replacing darkness with light. And this emphasis on freedom and liberty is a hugely important modern theme, and we're going to encounter it again and again over the course of the next few months. And in part, this implicates the church because often what modern thinkers and social reformers are trying to liberate people from is what they often saw as slavish, uncritical, blind devotion to religious faith. And that's a project of liberation. It's an effort to promote freedom, right? I mean, in one way, of course, it becomes a fight within the Christian tradition for toleration and freedom of religion. You don't have to, assume, as the Catholic Church insisted at the time, and indeed still insists, that you can't achieve salvation except through one institution, namely the Roman Church. Rather, we ought to respect religious differences and respect freedom of conscience. And again, that's absolutely characteristic of the modern period, this emphasis on liberation, emancipation, and freedom from various forces that oppress and threaten people. And of course, concomitant with that is a certain strong tendency towards individualism. Because if you ask, who is to be emancipated? For most of the thinkers we're going to be looking at, the answer is individuals, right? It's the individual who needs to be liberated from various forms of oppression, who needs to be brought out into the light. And that, of course, is one reason why in modern political thought there's such an emphasis on individual rights, right? Because individual rights are thought by many of the thinkers we're going to be looking at as protecting the freedom and independence of the individual person. These two themes, the themes of emancipation, liberation, freedom, and individual independence, are, I want to suggest, particularly clear in the piece of Kant's that I asked you to look at, What is Enlightenment? Because that text, he's writing, of course, at the height of the European Enlightenment, this period of intellectual growth and exploration that occurs largely as a result of how impressed people were by Isaac Newton's scientific achievements in the 18th century. And Kant asks in this essay, do we live in an enlightened age? And what does it mean to live in an enlightened age? And his answer is, yes, we are living in an age that is enlightening itself. We're not there yet. Here again, we see this sense of progress and directionality and a sense of optimistic improvement. We're not there yet, but we do live in an age of enlightenment in which individuals are daring to be wise. They're daring to question authority. They're daring to question dogma. They're daring to call into question tradition and asserting their autonomy from traditions and ideas that they've been socialized passively and uncritically to accept. And you see that very, very clearly, I suggest, in Kant's piece. And it's in that sense entirely characteristic of the modern period, and that's why I assigned it. Incidentally, a quick small point of clarification on the Kant, because it's something that I know may have caused some of you confusion. In the middle of that essay, Kant talks about the public and private use of reason. And I think it's just important to highlight that he uses that language in a way that is likely to strike us as very odd. And if you were taken by surprise by that, it's not your fault. It's just a sort of idiosyncrasy of the way Kant is talking, right? Kant talks about the public use of reason in terms of what we would think of as civil society, right? People writing op-eds, people doing philosophy, people publishing pamphlets, engaging in each other in civic dialogue in the pub, that sort of thing. And he calls that the public use of reason. And what he means by public there is kind of dialogue, right? Social discussion, discourse, that sort of thing. That's why he uses the word public. But of course, we would be inclined to call that private discussion. We would be inclined to call that people expressing their private thoughts, albeit publishing them in op-eds and newspapers and online in blogs and so forth. Conversely, Kant refers to the standpoint that public officials occupy as a situation in which they're constrained in what they can do and act by the restrictions of their role, right? I mean, and he refers that to us, oddly, as the private use of reason, right? So the DMV official who says, well, look, I agree with you as a human being, I shouldn't be enforcing this rule, but I'm just a DMV agent, I have to enforce the rules in virtue of my role as a bureaucrat, right? And we would think of that as actually a more public context, but Kant oddly refers to that as the private use of reason. And I just wanted to highlight that because you're likely to have been a little bit confused about this. It's just a kind of clash between two different terminologies. Don't worry too much about it. I just wanted to offer you some reassurance. A fifth characteristic modern theme is, of course, goes along with the others, and it's an increasing emphasis on equalization and therefore a push to democratize social and political life. Right? The struggle for emancipation against the church, against the feudal period in the modern period, is usually couched as a struggle against hierarchy, right? A struggle against this world in which there's an order, a hierarchical order of social classes and caste and so forth. And in the modern period, there's a sustained push to overthrow these hierarchies of rank and wealth and aristocracy and nobility and replace it with a flatter, more horizontal, as opposed to vertical kind of social organization. And this is, of course, particularly clear in the French Revolution, which thinks of itself as an attack on the privileges of the ancien régime, the old regime. Again, notice the contrast with the new regime that's implicit in that. So the push towards the new is understood typically in the modern period, and especially in the French Revolution, as a struggle for human equality, to institute a horizontal plateau of human equality as opposed to a world of inequality and privilege. And of course, we still use this language today, and to this extent, we're still children of the modern period. You know, when people use the language of white privilege today, they're still using this essentially 18th century language of struggling against hierarchies in the name of equality. And of course, inevitably, that brings with it a tendency to valorize democracy, which is a new thing in this period, right? I mean, until the 17th century and the 18th century, democracy was a dirty word. If you read the classic works of Greek antiquity, Plato and Aristotle, they regard democracy as one of the worst kinds of regimes. And it's very common in the medieval period for people to talk about democrats, small d, well, obviously small d because they didn't have a democratic party in the modern American sense at that time. Very often they use the word democracy in much the way we use the word fascist today, right? It's sort of obviously unacceptable, ridiculous position. But in the modern period, of course, that is turned upside down and upended, and people start seeing democracy as something to aim at rather than something to avoid. And as part of that, this is going to be very important in Hobbes and the social contract theorists, this idea that political authority and political power ultimately must be legitimated from below rather than from above is tremendously important. And that, of course, comes as part of the reaction against Christianity, because the Christian view, of course, is that ultimately authority, including political authority, ultimately comes from above, from God, the ultimate sovereign and Lord of the universe. And that is very much being pushed back against in the modern period, as I'm sure you all know. The sixth thing that I would want to emphasize about modernity is the importance of science and technology, and an increasing emphasis and trust in it. And again, it's important not to make too much of this. I've already emphasized that science and technology were not always completely opposed to pre-modern religious Christian forms of thought. They often went together. But it is a striking thing about the modern period. This is the early 17th century, is the beginning of the scientific revolution. Copernicus a little bit earlier, questioning the story about the geocentric universe. Galileo putting further pressure on that view and coming into conflict, of course, with the Catholic Church in the early 17th century in Italy. And then eventually Isaac Newton in the 17th century. So there's an increasing trust in and social investment in science and technology as tools by which humanity can progress, master nature, and improve its condition. This is the reason why I put Bacon on the syllabus and why I think it's worthwhile mentioning him. He was an early advocate of the scientific method as a way to solve human problems. And I think that the short passage on the four idols is particularly helpful because it's brief. But what I want you to particularly notice about that is that Bacon is particularly concerned to notice that there are inherent tendencies in human thinking towards illusion and delusion and error, right? And that these forms of error cause difficulties. And his four idols, the idols of the tribe and the idols of the cave, these are errors that he thinks are typical of human beings that stem from things in themselves. In the case of idols of the tribe, it's just sort of the basic characteristics of the human species, the fact that we gain knowledge of the world through our sense perceptions, and our sense perceptions are often easily fooled and are not always reliable. Think of optical illusions and so forth. His idols of the cave refer to the particular psychological crotchets and biases that individuals have that may prevent them from seeing the world accurately. But he also mentions two more social sources of distortion and illusion and bias. These are the idols of the marketplace and the idols of the theater. And what he's thinking of there is groupthink, in the case, what we would today call groupthink, ideology, people just sort of buying into the conventional wisdom of the age by carelessly using everyday language and expressions. That's the idols of the marketplace. The idols of the theater, similar but a more intellectual problem, where people get sort of invested in fidelity to some philosophical or religious school of thought, and they interpret everything through the lens of these particular philosophical beliefs or religious beliefs. And again, Bacon wants to say that this is a source of distortion. It means that people often see the world inaccurately, and we need, again, the emphasis on emancipation, we need to help people liberate themselves from all of this and become less deluded and more enlightened. And I think you can already see here actually a foreshadowing of both the utilitarians, because Bacon thinks that the point of doing science is to improve human welfare, right? I mean, he's distinctive in that. He's not so interested in science for its own sake. He writes this utopian text called The New Atlantis, in which he imagines a far-flung island that is ruled by a bunch of technocrats who basically do scientific research on what's going to make the citizens happy. He calls this institution, it's a kind of research university, like the CDC on steroids, right? He calls it Solomon's House. And this New Atlantis, he hopes, will be populated and ruled by a bunch of technocrats who understand how the world works based on science, right? And that's, I think, a clear foreshadowing of the utilitarians. You see in Bacon, too, a foreshadowing of a major theme in Marx, right? Marx wants to say, well, by understanding the world properly and scientifically, we can puncture the illusions and ideologies that people uncritically accept. And we'll see that very clearly in Marx. Some of you who've already read Marx will recognize what I'm talking about. But you see a foreshadowing of that in Bacon. What does Bacon think is the solution to these problems? How do we promote human welfare? Well, I've already told you that the answer is science, but it's science of a particular kind. And this is where the point about Aristotle and the new organon comes in. I think it's paragraph 40 in your excerpt. Bacon talks about induction. And what he means when he talks about induction, it's a pompous philosophical word, but he means simply observation, right? He means don't try to understand the world just by fiddling around with philosophical beliefs or with sacred texts or religious ideas. Don't just think that you can draw conclusions about the way the world is just by doing logical deduction. You have to actually look. You have to do experiments. You have to do empirical observation, right, and see the way the world really is. That emphasis on observation is, of course, central to the modern conception of science and technology, right? If Bacon were around today, I don't think this is too anachronistic. He would say, look, he would be with the Dr. Fauci's of the world, right? He'd be saying, look, stop politicizing what is essentially a problem about medicine. Right? You don't want to consult ideologues and religious fanatics and people with personal egos getting in the way when you're thinking about how to deal with a pandemic. Right? You want to consult epidemiologists. You want to consult scientists who base their findings on observation. That's the key to salvation in this area. And that's, again, a completely characteristic modern theme. So those are the 6 main things that I think are really characteristic of modern thought and modern culture, and you're going to see these cropping up over and over again in the writings that we're going to be looking at over the semester. I want to warn you against, briefly, another way of understanding modernity. And again, this is a bit of a sideswipe at our postmodern friends. I'm sorry to keep going on about them. But often, and you may have encountered this in other courses too, my colleagues and your classmates will often say that modernity, what's really characteristic of modernity, is a commitment to, or a privileging of, or a worshipping of reason or rationality. And this is not completely wrong, but it's a way of understanding modernity that I think is misleading and that we should try to resist. And I think I just want to mention a couple of reasons for this, and then when you take a course, when you hear a professor say something like this, you can get yourself an A+ by raising some critical questions about it. There are 3 reasons why I don't like that way of characterizing modernity. I mean, one problem is that reason means too many things. It's too broad a category, right? When we think about reasoning and using rationality, we might have many different kinds of things in mind, right? Sometimes we're thinking about doing science for its own sake, understanding knowledge, doing mathematics, being satisfied at the elegance of a logical proof or a geometrical theorem or something like that, right? Or sometimes we're talking about strategic planning, or we might be thinking of cost-benefit analysis, weighing up in a rational way the pros and cons, right? Sometimes we contrast reason with emotion, and we think of it in terms of detachment, right? And so when people identify modernity in terms of a commitment and worship of reason, I think because reason is a really ambiguous category, it doesn't really tell us a whole lot. It's better, I think, to specify modernity in terms of some of the themes that I just talked about, and that captures most of what people mean when they refer to modernity in terms of a privileging of reason. So instead of saying that the Enlightenment or modern thinkers cared about reason per se, we should say something like, something a bit more definite, like they really cared about science, and they were interested in the forms of reasoning that are associated with doing science and developing technologies, and that's fine, right? But the emphasis there is on the science and technology part. The reason part kind of smudges everything because it's not a terribly informative category. A second reason to resist this understanding of modernity in terms of reason is that I think it's false, actually, to say that modern social and political thinkers are always worshipping reason over other things, like especially passion, emotion, and desire. Sometimes it's quite the opposite. Two figures whom we won't be reading, two Scots, Adam Smith and David Hume, say more or less exactly the opposite of that, right? I mean, Adam Smith's major work in moral philosophy, some of you may have read it, it's a wonderful book. The title gives the game away, right? The title of Smith's book is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, right? He thinks of morality as essentially a matter of emotion, not a matter of reason. Hume, even more explicitly, he's notorious for having said in his Treatise of Human Nature that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, right? I mean, he's saying there not only that the passions are important, but that the passions rule and should rule reason. And you'll see this also in this course in Rousseau, right? In the second discourse, he very explicitly says things start to go wrong when people become invested in abstract reasoning, right? And part of his story about what has gone wrong in modern times is a story about how reason has overwhelmed some of our natural sentiments, especially a kind of emotional sympathy for the suffering of others. And you'll see this emphasis on emotion too in Hobbes very shortly. So I think it's also just misleading to say that what's distinctive about modern social and political theory is a kind of mindless worship of reason. It's certainly true of some. I mean, you could certainly accuse our friend Kant of this. He really does sometimes seem to say that morality and politics is fundamentally a matter of reason completely distinct from passion. But in some ways, Kant is an outlier in this regard. So that's a second reason to resist this common characterization of modernity in terms of the worship of or reverence for reason and rationality. And the final thing is that, of course, you know, if you characterize modernity in terms of a commitment to reason and rationality, you imply something which I think is deeply implausible, that before the modern period, people didn't care very much about reason, or that they were indifferent to mobilizing reason to solve problems and to confront the world. And that's a complete distortion, right? The idea that the thinkers of classical antiquity didn't care about reason is simply false. If you pick up Aristotle, Aristotle's ethics and his politics, one of the first things he says is that man is the rational animal, and it's all about reason. Ditto for Plato. It's also true for the Christians in the medieval and early modern period. You know, if you went to Aquinas and said, you know, you're just a Christian and so you're concerned about faith and you don't care about reasoning about God or anything like that, he'd laugh you out of the room. Of course, you know, theology for them is itself an exercise of the rational faculty. Right, so that's a third reason why I don't think it's very helpful to speak of modernity in terms of a privileging of reason, because it implies that a commitment to reason as such is somehow something that only dawns on human civilization in the 16th or 17th centuries, and that's of course a completely nutty idea. The idea that people didn't care about reasoning about things, or didn't have some conception of sanity or insanity or rationality before about 1610 is a completely silly thing to say. Okay, I'd hoped to be able to say a little bit more about the particular political ramifications of modern political theory and talk a little bit about the state and the modern commercial economy, but I haven't left myself quite enough time to do that. So I'll start there with my remarks on Hobbes in the next lecture. That's enough for today. I hope I haven't been going too fast, and I will see you very shortly. Thank you very much.